Okay, cool. So yeah, is this your first time being on someone else's podcast? I know you've started your own.
Yeah, no, I've been on a few other podcasts. I've been on Benjamin Boyce's show, Unity, I think a few others, but nothing else that's like a fairly big name.
Yeah, so let's talk about. Let's start with the tablet article, "The Rise of the Midwits," I believe is the title.
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure what the headline they ran with, but yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah, that's a source of some controversy and mystery. Just who decides to come up with these headlines? I mean, I know the editors will often choose, but I would imagine sometimes they like what the writer has chosen. Um, so yeah, the claim there is that Wilkism, that phenomenon, is sort of particularly suited to the slightly above average strata of, I guess, maybe second tier intellectuals in society, and that the truly brilliant, as well as I suppose the truly dumb, who are paying no attention, are flanking that above and below. Would you say that's a decent summary, or?
Yeah, so that's the kind of first line approximation.
Yeah.
Of course, with any kind of partition, any kind of group, you're going to have exceptions. But I think the core idea is that there's these kind of different ways of reasoning to a point. You kind of have at the lowest level just reasoning by instinct, and that's often the kind of like base uh, impulsive kind of appeal in politics. And then you have this kind of middle section, or this kind of like middle upper section, which is kind of reasoning by authority, or reasoning by consensus, or reasoning by conformity, where you aren't necessarily really thinking through your propositions. You're not actually looking into what this ultimate data actually is, but you're instead drawing conclusions from what other people around you, specifically other people around you with status, are doing. And then at the very top, you have people who are really invested into actually finding the truth and actually digging through all of the actual papers. These are the people who are actually experts in a specific thing, actually kind of very adept in having a track record of being accurate at describing the world or predicting the world, so on and so forth. And yeah, I do think it breaks down roughly along this kind of like um, lower kind of culture, and then like midwits, and then like what I describe as the talent elite, the people who actually have the talents to make actual predictions or products or whatever about the world, and that's the kind of partition that really has shifted politics in the past few decades.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I suppose there are some people whose expertise is precisely in the space of consensus, conformity, social harmony. I think maybe someone like a social psychologist might be an example of that. So to some degree, yeah, the midwit can be a form of its own expertise, as far as a high level word here to use or term to use is reading the room, or not high level but general use of the term
Yeah,
reading.
yeah, but you have to understand that there's this kind of, well, the origins of this article really is that there's this kind of meme, right? There's this meme, and you can probably link it in the show notes,
Uh,
where there's this kind of curve, and there's a lot of people clumped in the middle of the curve, and they're saying something kind of like silly or something that's just wrong, and then you have people on the left side of the curve who are kind of considered to be like less intelligent, but they're making some claim, and then people on the right side of the curve who are kind of more intelligent, and they're actually making the same claim. So the idea is that this kind of midwit class, they're actually making more mistakes. They're reasoning worse than if you just followed your instincts and if you just didn't really think about it. And that the people who are thinking about it, who are thinking about it the most, kind of end up at those same conclusions. Um, and
yeah,
how this translates to this kind of social psychology divide, right? Is that is that there's the kind of people who study a thing, and there's the people who are consumed by it. So it's kind of like if you're a chemist who knows the exact chemical makeup of heroin versus if you're a heroin addict. These are two very different people with two very different skill sets and very different sets of behaviors. And yeah, I do think there are people who are kind of experts in understanding how these social interactions or these kind of events of conformity play out. But they're also that's not the midwit class. That would be more closer to the talent elite class if their expertise is really is actually accurate. The kind of midwit class is the kind of people who, on average, here I'm saying this is like, of course, a generalization, who are kind of just taking these propositions who are shared by their friends or shared by whatever their favorite news outlet is, and just kind of takes it for granted and doesn't really read past anything there.
Yeah. In fact, an example of a social psychologist who is decidedly against the kind of midwit POV would be someone like Jonathan Haidt. So yeah, I see the distinction there, right? It's people who are describing the phenomenon of social contagion and conformity, and then those who are perpetuating it, actually practicing it, in the
right
latter group. Yeah, it's interesting about reasoning by instinct. So yeah, I have seen a sort of an overlap between the ultra smart and what is derisively called out of proles or populists sometimes, and I'm thinking specifically about men and women, the traditional roles of men and women, right? So you have the midwits who are kind of bucking the what they believe to be the ossified common point of view on men and women, and then the smart, the ultra smart, overlapping with those at the bottom who are just kind of acting on instinct and tradition. You have those who actually study biology very closely, those in the STEM field who end up sort of reinforcing the views in many ways of those at the bottom. And then you have the midwits who are taking a sort of contrarian stance that you would associate with the ultra smart, but at this point has become just sort of trendy. So yeah, there's sort of a high-low coalition of smart and those who aren't particularly intelligent or thoughtful. They come to end up reinforcing and backing up their instinctual claims. So, yeah, right is the new left. There was an article by Scott Alexander years ago kind of showing that this was what's happened. So you would have grandma and grandpa in flyover country with their traditional views, and those who've gone to college but are not, PhD level population geneticists or biologists or anything like that, who disagree. And then the actual people who study, man and woman as animals in great detail. Reinforcing the views of grandpa and grandma back in Smallville or something. So that's
I think what you're pointing to is that there's this idea of the blank slate, right? So the blank slate, and there's an excellent book by Steven Pinker explaining what the blank slate is and essentially debunking it. But the blank slate is this assumption that people have no essential characteristics or no biological characteristics, that essentially what they become, how they act, what attributes they have are driven completely by nurture or completely by the environment. And you do any kind of serious research on this and you notice that this is just categorically false. But you have these kind of assumptions. I don't think they're taken literally, but there's this kind of weird knowledge diffusion process that happens where you kind of get these obviously false assumptions in on one end, and we're going to say, and they build their field. People in certain parts of psychology and sociology, and of course all these kind of activist subjects who build their field by taking in that assumption, by producing a bunch of work on top of that. You can judge for yourself how good that quote unquote work actually is. And then they get these kind of endpoints that are now being enforced partially socially, partially by this kind of prestige system in academia that is built on this assumption of the blank slate. And if you kind of confront them and you say, oh, do you actually think there are no essential biological characteristics? Most people will either say, like, no, we don't actually think that, or they'll say, well, I'm not a biologist, I can't really tell you. But if you actually try to work out their line of reasoning, you're trying to work out why they're making the arguments that they're making, it's pretty clear that this assumption is embedded within their thought process or embedded within where they started. And what this creates, and this is something that's very characteristic of this kind of midwit segment in general, is that it creates a kind of like very long chain of reasoning that you have to work back to before you can actually understand like where they went wrong and how you can actually kind of disprove their points, aside from just like pointing at statistics or something like that. And I think that that's a very essential characteristic of these types of arguments from authority, is that you have to trace them back, and it's often quite difficult to do that.
Okay. Would you say that those who espouse this kind of blank slate ideology, do you think they are actually following a fairly consistent chain of reasoning, or they're just compartmentalizing a lot of different trendy points of view and then throwing it all together?
Yeah, that's actually a very good that's actually a very good question. I slipped up a little bit, and I'm glad you caught it. But it really depends what you mean by they. And I think this is something that you put on the agenda as well, put on the kind of topics that we might discuss as well. But if you mean they as kind of a group, then there is some sort of phylomimology going on here, where you have these like memes, right? You have these ideas that evolve and that are shared, and you can trace back those ideas, but they're jumping from person to person. There's not necessarily one person you can go to who can kind of list the entire ideological development from start to finish. But you do have this kind of development over time that I think is this kind of like evolutionary process, or like this kind of developing process where one person takes the idea, they make some kind of edit, or they combine it with another idea, they pass it on, and eventually you get to the ideas that you see today.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, when I say they, yeah, it depends what tier of intellectual. Maybe that's too generous a word, but I don't think it is. That we're operating, or that we're pointing to, right? So you have like the originators, the kind of creative synthesizers in academia, certain influencers, although that's a very new term that I don't know is too useful here. But yeah, and then you have this kind of hodgepodge of people on Twitter just repeating things. I think that latter group is the one just sort of throwing things against the wall and seeing what sticks, or rather knowing what to throw against the wall and what will stick. And yeah, you have the people further upstream, Robin DiAngelo or Ibram Kendi, whatever.
Yeah, I want to push back on this framing as well. We can talk about the kind of specific applied stuff later,
Yeah.
but people often like to kind of create these kind of strict orderings where it's like, okay, it's academia first, then it's like corporations, then it goes on to tech, and then it goes on to social media. That's not actually how any of this works, because of course academics are on Twitter, and the way that Twitter is influences the academics to begin with. So you actually stop, you take a step back, and you ask yourself the question, like, has Twitter changed how academia operates? And the answer is almost certainly yes. Creating these kind of social followings is almost certainly a way to get more citations, which is a way to increase your prestige in academia, and is a way that warps what content that people are actually putting, what kind of research people are putting out, or what kind of philosophy, etc., that people are putting out. And so you have this kind of weird, you kind of have this blob where you can't just say, oh, it's a very clear case of saying like, oh, this is the thing that started it all. This is the thing that is upstream of everything else. So it is a lot more convoluted than that, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, it actually reminds me of that writer B.J. Campbell, or hand waving freakoutery. That guy,
Yes.
his notion of the egregore, right? And it's coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. So even the metaphor of upstream downstream is a bit dated. It's almost like it's from a time when there was sort of one to many communication styles, of such as television or something like that. We are in a much more complicated information environment now. So yeah, I think B.J. Campbell used the example of the CDC getting its talking points from Twitter rather than during the earlier days of COVID.
Yeah, how familiar is your audience with the idea of an egregore?
Uh, Probably not too familiar. I do these just once a month, and that's fairly new. So do you want to explain that?
Yeah, I think the analogy that B.J. Campbell uses is that the origin of the word egregore is kind of this idea that you have some sort of cult or you have some sort of dark group that comes together, participates in some ritual, and out of the void comes this mass spirit that possesses all of them and commands them to do all of these kind of nefarious acts. And now you ask yourself, is this guy coming on this podcast to tell me that the world is kind of like possessed by this demonic spirit? Well, literally no. But as a metaphor, this can be very powerful because, of course, we like to pretend that everyone is making their rational decisions. I think maybe some of us are kind of past that, right? And we realize that a lot of what happens in politics, what happens in these social movements, and so on and so forth, is a kind of ritualistic behavior. Is a kind of behavior where people are taking these cues, people are emotionally manipulated or warped. And because of that, they're all behaving collectively in this kind of strange, unexplainable way. And so that's the way that this term egregore is used. And when we're thinking about how this applies to politics, it just means like when you see a lot of people who are acting together in this kind of strange mob mentality, when it seems like it's coordinated, but not in a way where everyone has gotten their instructions, right? It's not like Otto von Bismarck is telling all these military generals and they're telling the soldiers, and that's why they're all marching in lockstep. No, that's not what's happening. What's happening is that there's kind of this strange behavior that people get into when they're for example, like in a mob, in a crowd, in a kind of sports coliseum, where they're deciding their behavior off of other people's behavior, and there's this kind of effect that takes them over.
Yeah, at least with the an IRL mob, the origin point is much clearer, and the effects are localized. When it's online, it seems to spring up almost everywhere. Although, if you're diligent enough, you can trace an origin point there as well. But yeah, you used a term a moment ago, phylomomology.
Yes.
That's not a term so it sounds to me like someone who's a fan of momology, like as if anti-momology or philo-Semitism, anti-Semitism. That's what I'm mapping it onto.
What do you mean? I don't think you heard me right. I mean memology, as in like the study of memes, right? Is that what you heard, or something else?
Yeah, and I actually typed it, wrote it down. PHILO, memology, like philo-Semitism or philo.
I think it should be Y. It's so like phylogenetics. Phylogenetics
Okay,
is essentially the study of genes tracing back through their ancestors. So
oh, I see.
yeah, so essentially you see like you have this certain trait. Let's say you have like brown eyes, and then you can trace this back to, let's say, your father had brown eyes, or your mother, and then you trace that back to your grandmother, and so on and so forth. And what I was talking about there is that you can do the same thing with these kind of ideas. You can say, here's an idea, here's the precursor to an idea, or here's an assumption for that idea. And then you can keep going and repeat the same process like that, just like you find your family tree.
Kind of mimetic lineage, yeah.
Exactly.
So this notion of blank slate, I made a note here. I think it's interesting that we talk about a kind of enduring biology, or in this case, I'm going to go with sexual orientation. And yet, surveys show that younger people are identifying with being lesbian or gay at almost record levels. So it does seem to me as if there's something very interesting going on at the cultural level that leaves a lot of room for it, a kind of blank slate mentality, and yet is denied by many of those on the right. So blank slateism is incorrect.
Yeah, no. I don't think like
people claiming to be, something other than straight in such a short period of time. I find that.
Okay, so there's kind of two questions here, right? One is specifically with regards to sexual orientation, and one is with regards to the use of the blank slate in general, or attacks on the blank slate in general. I think I'll talk about the second one first, just because it's like very short. I don't think like Pinker or any of the people who attack the blank slate say that there's no impact due to like social phenomenon. Of course, you have these kind of measures. You have measures across various things, and of course, you can have things that change based on your environment. It would be silly to say that, like, for example, like malnutrition obviously is something that has a heavy impact. So it's not one or the other. And I think people who reject the blank slate don't reject it in favor of like complete biological determinism. No, it's a mixture of things in between. Um, with regards to the sexual orientation stuff, I think here is actually a question where honest researchers get it right, honest academics get it right. And what I mean by honest is the people who are looking at the kind of survey design, the kind of mechanism design. Um, because in any kind of psychological or sociological study, in order to actually find out whether something is having an effect or whether an assumption is true, say the assumption that, for example, the number of people who will be gay or lesbian or any kind of orientation will stay the same over time. In order for that to be true, you actually have to preserve, you have to maintain constant a bunch of other features that could possibly bias the result. So like the obvious example here is if you have like a large kind of massive social media or legacy media effect that it's kind of like saying like either in either direction, saying it's either very bad for you to say this to for example someone who's asking you on the phone, or saying exactly the opposite, that it's very good for you to like tell this to someone who's asking you about it on the phone. Then of course you're going to get an effect. Or at least, of course, it's possible that you're going to get an effect, and that any kind of self-respecting kind of sociologist is going to find some way in order to study similarly circumstanced some people with similar circumstances and similar traits across time in order to actually get if this is true. Um, so I think in this scenario, actually trying to do that is quite difficult, just because of how much societies have changed over time, and how little we've preserved a control group. I don't think we have really preserved a control group, at least in Western countries, at all. Um, so yeah, this is just something that is very difficult to study and answer in general. And I do agree with you, the original point, that it's not like 100% guaranteed to be constant, but actually studying it is quite difficult.
Yeah, and it feels like there's been a great deal of sort of category inflation, getting far away from sort of a strict core deviation from being straight. Something like queer, for instance, is a bit of a fuzzy term. It appears to mean something like I don't identify with traditional straight orientation, straight people behavior, that kind of thing. But what exactly queer means, if you're getting away from women who prefer women or men who prefer men, you know, just what that is open to a lot of interpretation, it seems. So